Hey guys, tonight we're dripping in sweat, fanning ourselves with our own disappointment and absolutely suffering, because tonight we're talking about summer before air conditioning existed. Not the romantic lemonade on the porch version of summer, the real one. The one where the temperature climbed past what any reasonable civilization should have allowed, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing you could do about it. No thermostat, no ceiling fan, no cold brew from a refrigerated case, just you, the sun, and the complete and utter absence of mercy. Before we melt into the floor together, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a massive heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and honestly, I felt that suggestion in my soul the second I read it. Your ideas are what keep this channel alive and growing, and I mean that sincerely. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always midnight somewhere and somehow 85 degrees. And if you haven't already, the channel's now live on Spotify, so check the link in the description and listen wherever you get comfortable. Now, dim the lights. Put on a fan, because tonight of all nights, you absolutely need one. Find your coldest pillow, stretch out, get yourself a glass of water, because you're going to want it. Before we begin, let me just ask you a few things. Have you ever wondered what people did in the summer when ice was a luxury only the wealthy could afford? When there were no freezers, no cold drinks, no way to escape the heat except to sit very still and hope for a breeze, did people just accept it? Did they sleep? How did anyone wear a corset in July and survive? What happened to food? What happened to cities? All that stone and cobblestone and wool clothing? What did a heat wave in 1850 actually feel like when you had nowhere to go and nothing to cool you down? Could you have made it through a single August day without losing your mind? Congratulations! You've just woken up in the summer of 1875. Your nightgown is already stuck to you. There is no fan. The window is open and it has done absolutely nothing. Somewhere outside a horse is also suffering. Welcome to summer. You don't wake up refreshed. You wake up wet. The sheets beneath you feel like they've been marinated in a warm, slightly salty soup, and the pillow that was supposed to be your sanctuary has betrayed you completely by absorbing roughly a pint of what your body quietly produced overnight. Long before air conditioning came along to save humanity from itself, summer mornings were a form of slow, sweaty shock therapy. The bedroom, that private sanctuary of rest, was, in July and August, indistinguishable from a steam room nobody had signed up for. You peel yourself off the mattress, and we do mean peel. The cotton or linen beneath you has formed a kind of biological seal, skin against fabric, fabric against straw or horsehair stuffing, all of it fused by the particular glue that is a human body's response to 8 hours of trapped heat. The mattress itself, whatever it's filled with, has been absorbing your warmth all night and giving it back with interest. There is no cool side. There is no other side. There is only the side you've been on, and it is damp and it smells like you specifically after a full night of effort. The room around you is not better. A bedroom in a pre-AC home in the middle of summer was a closed, airless box that had spent all of the previous day soaking up heat through the walls and roof. Stone absorbed it. Brick absorbed it. Wood absorbed it. And then, obligingly, it released everything it had collected straight back into the room after sunset, right through the hours when you were trying to sleep. Opening a window helped only if there was a breeze, and a breeze at 2 a.m. in July was something you hoped for the way medieval peasants hope for rain, reverently and without much expectation. The people who slept in these rooms developed a whole taxonomy of strategies, each more desperate than the last. You tried sleeping on top of the covers. You tried wetting the covers. You tried a damp cloth on your forehead, which worked for approximately 4 minutes before becoming its own warm, sodden problem. You moved your pillow to the foot of the bed because surely that end was cooler. It wasn't. You lay very still because moving generated heat, and heat was the enemy. And somewhere around 3 a.m, you had a philosophical crisis about whether it was physically possible to be still enough to stop being a warm mammal entirely. Rich people had options that poor people did not. If you had money, your bedroom might have high ceilings that allowed hot air to rise away from you. You might have windows on 2 sides of the room that enabled a cross breeze if the stars aligned meteorologically. You might own enough light cotton bedding, rather than the heavier wool alternatives available to poorer households, to make summer nights merely unpleasant rather than genuinely dangerous. You might even have access to ice, which you could place in a shallow basin near an open window, in the hope that some small mercy would be carried toward you on the night air. Poor people had floors. The floor was often the coolest available surface in a summer bedroom, lower, closer to the earth, not yet fully warmed by the day's radiation. Families sometimes relocated to floors by August. Children were put there first, then adults joined them. This was not failure. This was adaptation. This was the human species doing what it has always done, which is figure out where the least suffering is and move toward it on hands and knees in the dark. By morning, everyone was tired, sticky, and quietly furious at the sky. Breakfast was coming, and it involved a stove, which meant more heat, which meant the house was about to get worse before it got any better. The day hadn't even started, and you were already behind. Before engineers figured out how to cool a building from the inside, architects had to figure out how to design their way around the heat, and for centuries they got it spectacularly wrong before occasionally getting it spectacularly right. Stone townhouses absorbed the day's heat and radiated it back through the night like a slow, personal oven. Brick row houses in American cities were infamous for it. By midnight, the walls of a 19th century urban home were still warm to the touch, still breathing out the afternoon sun like they had a personal grudge against sleeping. The problem was physics, and physics did not negotiate. Dense materials like stone and brick are excellent thermal masses. They absorb enormous quantities of heat during the day and release it slowly over many hours. This property makes them useful in certain climates, at certain times of year, when you want a building to stay warm through a cold night after a mild day. In summer, in cities, it was the opposite of what anyone wanted. The building became a battery, storing the sun's energy all afternoon and discharging it directly into your bedroom until dawn. Wooden buildings were only marginally better. Wood absorbed heat more quickly than masonry, and released it faster, which at least meant that wooden homes cooled down sooner after sunset. But wooden structures in cities also meant fire risk, cramped construction, and frequently poor ventilation, problems that cancelled out any thermal advantage they offered. In the tenement districts of New York and Chicago, wooden or brick buildings were packed tightly enough together that they created their own microclimates, blocking any movement of air between them and trapping heat in the narrow streets below, like liquid in a glass. Architects who were paying attention, and many were, particularly in hot climates where the stakes were obvious, developed responses. The antebellum plantation house of the American South was, among other things, a climate engineering project. High ceilings that let hot air rise above the living space, deep covered verandas that shaded the walls from direct sun, windows designed to open from both top and bottom to allow hot air out while cool air entered below. The result was not air conditioning. It was not even close to comfortable by modern standards. But it was intelligent, and it worked tolerably well for people who had no other option. In the Mediterranean, courtyard architecture solved a version of the same problem. A house built around a central open courtyard created a microclimate. The courtyard cooled at night, and as warm air rose from it during the day, it drew cooler air through the lower rooms of the surrounding house. This passive ventilation, free, architectural, requiring no fuel or machinery, had been understood and applied for thousands of years by the time 19th century American builders were stacking brick row houses with no regard for airflow whatsoever. What those American builders were doing instead was following the economics and aesthetics of the moment, which did not particularly prioritize summer comfort. You built densely because land was expensive. You built quickly because demand was urgent. You used whatever materials were cheap and local. The result in city after city was a housing stock that performed admirably in winter and became a seasonal catastrophe in summer. People who bought these homes in October had no idea what they were agreeing to until the following July, when the walls started giving back everything the sun had put in them, and the bedroom temperature at midnight remained somewhere above 80 degrees with the windows open. No one sued. No one demanded a refund. You simply bought a fan when you could afford one, moved your family to the sleeping porch if you had one, or opened every window in the house and hoped the night would eventually cool down enough to make sleep possible. Sometimes it did, often it didn't. And in August, even the mornings were warm before they were anything else. In the early 1800s, a man named Frederick Tudor had what most people considered the worst business idea in American history: cut ice from frozen Massachusetts ponds in winter, pack it in sawdust, load it onto ships and sell it to places like Havana, Calcutta, and New Orleans. Everyone laughed. Then everyone bought ice. Tudor became known as the Ice King, and the trade he built transformed how wealthy Americans experienced summer, turning a seasonal misery into something briefly, expensively, deliciously bearable. The logic was simple, even if the logistics were not. New England winters produced reliable, thick lake ice every year. This ice, if properly insulated, could survive a sea voyage to tropical ports and arrive still solid enough to be useful. Tudor figured this out before anyone else, spent years losing money on the experiment, and eventually perfected the combination of sawdust insulation, purpose-built ice houses, and efficient cutting techniques that made the whole enterprise profitable. By the 1830s and 40s, the American ice trade was a genuine industry, cutting hundreds of thousands of tons of ice per year from lakes like Walden Pond in Massachusetts and shipping it to customers in the American South, the Caribbean, and as far away as India. The cutting itself was remarkable to watch. In January and February, when the ice was at its thickest, teams of men moved onto the frozen surface with horse-drawn scoring tools that cut parallel grooves across the ice in both directions, creating a grid. Then workers broke the blocks free along those lines and floated them down channels cut through the ice itself to the shore, where they were hoisted onto wagons and transported to the ice house. An efficient crew could cut and store thousands of tons in a season. It was cold, dangerous, skilled work, and the men who did it were paid in cash and frostbite in roughly equal measure. What this ice meant to the people who received it was difficult to overstate. A block of natural lake ice in a Charleston or New Orleans home in July was a minor miracle. A piece of a Massachusetts winter transported by ship to a place where the temperature had not dropped below 70 degrees in months. You could cool your drinks. You could keep food from spoiling for an extra day or two. You could chip a piece off and hold it against your wrist in the afternoon and feel, briefly, like a different kind of person, one for whom summer was survivable rather than merely endurable. But this was emphatically a luxury of the prosperous. Ice was expensive, perishable, and required an icebox to be useful, which was itself an additional expense. Working-class families in hot cities did not have iceboxes. They did not have ice. They had water from a shared pump or a tap, whatever temperature the summer had made it, and whatever cooling strategies they could devise from materials already in their possession. The natural ice trade peaked around the 1870s and 80s, and then began its decline as mechanical ice making. The ability to manufacture artificial ice using refrigeration technology spread into cities. By the turn of the 20th century, manufactured ice was replacing harvested ice in most American markets. By 1910 or so, the great ice houses of New England were emptying out, the ice-cutting crews disbanding, Frederick Tudor's empire quietly dissolving into a new era. But for nearly a century, a frozen New England pond was the thing standing between a significant portion of the world's wealthier citizens and full, unmitigated summer suffering. They carved it out in January and shipped it to July, and people paid for it gratefully every time. Before the refrigerator arrived to save civilization, there was the icebox, a wooden cabinet lined with tin or zinc, filled with a large block of ice delivered every few days by a man with tongs and very good arms. In theory, it kept your food cool. In practice, it kept your food slightly less warm than the room it sat in, dripped a slow and constant river of water onto your kitchen floor, and required you to remember, always, to empty the drip pan before it overflowed across the linoleum at 2 a.m. The icebox appeared in American homes in the early 19th century and spread steadily through the middle and upper classes across the 1800s. By 1880 or so, a decent icebox was considered a household necessity for any family that could afford one, roughly equivalent in status to what a dishwasher might represent today, a convenience that quickly became a dependency. You could get them in sizes ranging from small apartment models to large kitchen installations that held several £100s of ice and cost accordingly. Cabinet makers built them, hardware stores sold them, and the women who managed households organised their entire food preservation strategy around them. The mechanics were simple, but the maintenance was relentless. Ice occupied the upper chamber, cold air fell below it into the food storage area, and meltwater drained through a pipe into a metal pan beneath the cabinet. The whole system worked reasonably well at maintaining temperatures somewhere between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit when the ice was fresh, declining toward room temperature as the block melted and the delivery day approached. A kitchen in July, with an icebox whose last delivery was 3 days ago, was not keeping anything particularly cold. It was performing a kind of thermal wishful thinking. The drip pan was the great domestic nemesis of the icebox era. Forget to empty it for a day, and the kitchen floor became a shallow lake. Forget for 2 days, and you had a situation. Women wrote about the drip pan with a particular exhausted familiarity of someone describing a chronic problem that could be managed but never solved. Always there. Always threatening. Always the thing you remembered at the wrong moment. When electric refrigerators began to spread in the 1920s and 30s, the drip pan was among the first things that enthusiastic advertisements promised you would never have to think about again. Consumers believed them and bought accordingly. Food storage in the icebox era required a kind of vigilance that modern refrigerator owners have completely forgotten how to perform. You checked things. You smelled things. You made decisions about meat that needed to be eaten today rather than tomorrow. You planned your meals around what was freshest, what was oldest, what was about to cross the invisible line between food and something else. Leftovers were not stored indefinitely in sealed containers to be excavated weeks later. They were eaten the next day, or they were not eaten at all. This was not waste consciousness or environmental virtue. It was simply the reality of keeping food in a box of melting ice in a warm kitchen. The icebox was eventually replaced by the mechanical refrigerator, almost completely by the 1940s, though in rural areas without reliable electricity the transition took longer. When it went, it took with it a whole domestic rhythm, the Iceman's schedule, the drip pan, the careful meal planning, the daily negotiation with spoilage. The refrigerator made food storage thoughtless in the best possible sense. The icebox had required you to think about it all the time, and in summer, when the ice melted faster and the food spoiled faster, and the kitchen was already 90 degrees, that constant thinking was one more tax on a season that was already charging you everything it could. There was a time in American life when the arrival of the Iceman was the social event of the morning. He came with his horse-drawn wagon, his massive iron tongs, and a block of ice that weighed anywhere from 25 to 100 pounds depending on what you'd ordered. Children chased the wagon for slivers. Housewives rearranged their schedules around his route. In the summer, the Iceman wasn't just delivering a product, he was delivering hope, delivered directly through the back door in a dripping, glorious frozen slab. The Iceman's route was a fixed geography of dependency. He came through the same streets on the same days, generally in the morning, his wagon piled with blocks cut and stored the previous winter in insulated ice houses. Each block was wrapped in burlap or straw to slow the melting during transit. By midsummer, even with insulation, a significant portion of the day's load was gone before the wagon reached its last customers. Those customers had learned to be home early. To be the last stop on an Iceman's route in August was to receive whatever was left, at whatever size it happened to be, and to be grateful for it regardless. Households displayed cards in their windows to tell the Iceman what they needed. These ice cards were typically printed with large numbers at each corner, 25, 50, 75, 100, indicating the number of pounds requested. You placed the card in the window with the number you wanted at the top, and the Iceman, reading it from the street, would carve or select the appropriate block. It was a quiet, efficient communication system that required no conversation and no delay. The Iceman read the window, brought the ice to the back door, and the household proceeded with its day. Transactional, yes, but also, in its way, a small piece of daily community infrastructure, a man who came to your door who knew your address, knew your habits, knew whether you were behind on your order. Children were the Iceman's unofficial street team. As the wagon moved through a neighbourhood, children materialised from porches and yards and followed at a respectful distance until a block was scored and broken, at which point they descended on the slivers and chips that fell to the street. This was not considered unsanitary, or if it was, that consideration lost immediately to the pleasure of holding a piece of ice in 90-degree heat. Parents mostly looked the other way. The Iceman mostly looked the other way. Everyone understood that chasing the ice wagon was a childhood rite of summer, as fundamental as anything else the season offered. The Iceman occupied a curious social position, familiar enough to be a neighbourhood fixture, close enough to enter homes through the back door with his tongs and his load, trusted with the access that daily service requires. In cities, he was often an immigrant or the son of immigrants, doing physical labour in all weather for modest wages. His work was seasonal in a particular way, busiest in summer when demand was highest, slowest in winter when the ice houses were being restocked rather than depleted. The physical demands of the job were significant. Handling 100-pound blocks of ice all day, in summer heat, required a particular kind of strength and endurance that didn't get romanticised the way it perhaps deserved. By the 1930s, the electric refrigerator was making serious inroads into the Iceman's customer base. By the 40s, in most American cities, the route was essentially over. The wagon and horse gave way to trucks for a few years, then the trucks had fewer and fewer stops. The ice cards disappeared from windows. The children who had chased the wagon grew up and told their children about it, and the children found this charming and slightly unbelievable, the way all old necessities eventually seem when the problem they solved has been solved more completely by something else. The Iceman was gone. The summer was still hot. But now there was something cold in the kitchen that never melted, and that changed everything. Here is a problem nobody thinks about until they sit with it. Before refrigeration and reliable plumbing, getting a genuinely cold drink in summer was either expensive, laborious, or simply impossible. Water, that basic human right, was frequently warm, frequently suspect, and frequently consumed with a small prayer that it wasn't going to give you something. Lemonade was a luxury. Beer was safer than water in some cities, and consumed at all hours with the casual acceptance of a civilization that had made its peace with a certain baseline of fermentation. Let's begin with water, because that is where every reasonable person begins when they are hot. In the cities of the 19th century, water came from wells, pumps, or distribution systems of varying quality and reliability, and in summer it arrived at temperatures that reflected the season. There was no cold tap. The underground pipes and cisterns that held municipal water could maintain cooler temperatures than the air, which helped somewhat, but a glass of water drawn from a city tap in August was not cold. It was tepid, at best. It was the temperature of mild disappointment. You drank it because you needed it, not because it provided any particular refreshment in the way that a cold glass of water provides refreshment. That specific, immediate, physical pleasure was simply not available to most people most of the time. In rural areas, the situation was somewhat different. Wells drew water from deeper in the ground, where temperatures stayed cooler year-round. Spring houses, built directly over natural springs, could keep water and other stored items at genuinely cool temperatures. A working farm with a good spring house had access to reasonably cool water in summer, not ice water, but better than what city residents were managing. This was one of the invisible advantages of rural life in an era before municipal systems made city water reliable, if not cold. Beer was a genuine alternative, and not just in the raucous, cheerful sense that the phrase implies. The fermentation process killed pathogens that might survive in untreated water, and in cities where the water supply was frequently contaminated by the same infrastructure that removed human waste, which is to say most of them, beer was genuinely safer to drink than water in ways that were empirically demonstrable, even before germ theory explained why. Working-class men drank beer at breakfast. Workers drank it during the day. This was not alcoholism. This was hydration strategy, pursued under real constraints by people who were aware, however imprecisely, that the water might kill them and the beer was more likely not to. Lemonade occupied a curious position as a summer drink, widely desired, genuinely refreshing, and available primarily to those who could afford both the lemons and the ice to make it cold. Street lemonade vendors appeared in American cities in summer, selling glasses from large jars or tin dispensers, and they were popular in proportion to the day's heat. A cold glass of lemonade on a hot street was a luxury item dressed as a casual purchase, and the pleasure it provided was real and immediate in ways that nothing warm could replicate. The wealthy served it from cut glass pitchers surrounded by ice at afternoon gatherings. The poor bought it by the glass from a man on a corner when they could spare the coin. What people were really after, of course, was coldness, the physical sensation of something cool moving through a hot body. And in summer, before refrigeration, coldness was a resource that had to be sourced, purchased, managed, and rationed. You planned around it. You thought about it. A truly cold drink was not an automatic rite of summer afternoons. It was a small achievement, requiring ice, and ice requiring money, and money being distributed in the usual uneven fashion. Most people in most summers made do with something closer to room temperature and called it adequate because there was nothing else to call it. People were not passive about the heat. They were creative, desperate, and occasionally brilliant in ways that make modern fans look almost insulting by comparison. Wet sheets hung in windows to cool the air as it passed through. Sleeping porches became architectural staples on American homes, a room specifically built for summer nights when the indoors was uninhabitable. People slept on rooftops in Mediterranean cities, on fire escapes in New York tenements, in hammocks strung between trees. Beds were moved outside. Children were relocated to cooler floors. Everyone was improvising. The wet sheet in the window was one of the oldest and most widely used techniques, simple, free, and moderately effective by the physics of evaporative cooling. You soaked a sheet, hung it across an open window, and whatever breeze existed would pass through it, cooling slightly as the water evaporated. On a still night, this did nothing. On a night with even a modest breeze, it provided a genuine reduction in temperature that made the difference between sleeping and lying awake, resenting every other sleeping mammal in the known world. The problem was maintenance. The sheet dried out within an hour or two, and someone had to get up and re-wet it in the dark, which required the kind of dedication to thermal comfort that disrupted the sleep it was meant to enable. Floors were utilised with the same unsentimental practicality that the situation demanded. Stone and tile floors, cooler than mattresses by virtue of their density and their contact with the earth below, became summer sleeping surfaces. People brought their bedding to the floor or dispensed with bedding entirely and simply lay on the coolest available surface they could find. Kitchen floors were often the best option in a house, particularly if the kitchen was on the ground level and the cooking fire had been out long enough for the room to cool somewhat. Children were placed there first, close to the ground, shielded from the worst of the radiant heat that rose through a house toward the upper floors. Upper floors were universally understood to be the worst place to sleep in summer. Heat rises, which in winter means warmth pooling in the rooms where people live and sleep, but in summer means the bedrooms, typically on the upper floors of any multi-story house, accumulated the most intense heat of the entire structure. Families who could arrange it moved their sleeping downstairs in summer. Those who could not lay in attic-adjacent bedrooms and negotiated with the ceiling. The hammock was the great outdoor sleeping technology of the pre-AC era, and it worked on principles that were genuinely sound. Suspended between trees or posts, it allowed air to circulate around the body on all sides, including underneath, where a mattress would otherwise trap heat. Cotton hammocks were better than wool blankets for summer sleeping. They breathed, they moved with the air, and they offered a surface that wasn't absorbing and radiating your own body heat. Back at you all night. They were used everywhere the climate made outdoor sleeping possible, across the American South, across Latin America, across the Caribbean, by people who had correctly identified that the problem with summer sleeping was being enclosed, and the solution was openness. Rooftop sleeping was a major feature of urban summer life in hot cities around the world. In New York, in the decades before and after 1900, the rooftops of tenement buildings became summer sleeping grounds for residents who found the apartments below uninhabitable. Families dragged mattresses up the stairs and arranged themselves under the open sky, which offered at least the possibility of a breeze and the certainty of slightly less reflected heat than the rooms below. There were social dimensions to rooftop sleeping. It was public, communal, neighbourly in ways that indoor life was not, and children especially remembered it later as one of the pleasures of a summer that was otherwise mostly an endurance event. The sky was visible, the air moved. Compared to what was happening 3 floors below, it was practically luxurious. Between roughly the 1880s and the 1950s, American homes were frequently built with a room that no longer exists and that most people have never heard of, this sleeping porch. It was exactly what it sounds like, a screened-in or open-air porch, usually on the 2nd floor, designed specifically for sleeping during summer months when the interior of a house became a slow-motion health crisis. Families migrated to these porches in June and didn't come back inside until September, sleeping in the breeze, under the stars, wrapped in light cotton and the complete absence of options. The sleeping porch emerged as a mainstream American architectural feature in the late 19th century, driven partly by practical heat escape and partly by the fashionable medical opinion of the time, which held that fresh night air was not merely pleasant but actively therapeutic. The same doctors who prescribed mountain resorts for tuberculosis patients and ocean air for nervous complaints were enthusiastic advocates of outdoor sleeping for the general population. Sleeping with windows open was considered healthful. Sleeping on a porch was considered even better. Building a room specifically for outdoor sleeping was considered, in the right social circles, a sign of both good taste and sound judgment about one's own respiratory health. The typical sleeping porch was a relatively simple addition to a house, framed out from an existing second-floor bedroom, screened to keep insects out, furnished with cots or narrow beds and minimal additional furniture. Because it was understood as a temporary seasonal space, it was not heated, not insulated, and not finished to the standard of the house's main rooms. Screens rather than glass windows kept the air moving freely. A canvas awning or a wide roof overhang kept rain out while allowing the sides to remain open. The effect on a summer night with any breeze at all was dramatically cooler than the rooms inside, sometimes by 10 or 15 degrees, enough to make the difference between sleeplessness and genuine rest. Families developed strong traditions around the sleeping porch migration. On a day in late May or early June, depending on the climate and the family, the household collectively decided it was time, and bedding was carried out, cots unfolded, and the porch put back into seasonal service. The same ceremony reversed itself in September, when the nights grew cool enough to make the main bedroom hospitable again. Children, who in many households were assigned the sleeping porch earlier and more readily than adults, often remembered these months as their favourite part of summer. The particular pleasure of falling asleep outside, of the sounds of the neighbourhood at night, of waking to birds and early light rather than the accumulated heat of a closed room. The sleeping porch declined with the spread of air conditioning. By the 1960s, new American homes were being built with mechanical cooling systems that made outdoor sleeping unnecessary rather than essential, and the architectural space that had served the sleeping porch function was reclaimed for other uses: an additional bedroom, a study, a storage room. Older homes that had sleeping porches converted them, enclosed them, or simply stopped using them as summer temperatures became something to be managed indoors with a thermostat rather than escape through a screen door. The sleeping porch did not go out dramatically. It just stopped being built, and then stopped being remembered except by people who had slept on them and missed the specific quality of those summer nights. Open to the air, slightly damp before dawn, fundamentally different from anything the climate-controlled interior could offer. Today, a sleeping porch is what real estate listings call a charming original feature, which is the way that modern people describe things that used to be necessary and are now merely quaint. What it actually was, for several generations of American families, was the room that made summer livable, and now it is gone, replaced by a machine in the wall that simply makes the problem not exist, which is more efficient but perhaps slightly less interesting as a way to spend a July night. The city in summer was something else entirely. It concentrated every worst feature of heat into a dense, airless, malodorous box, and added tens of thousands of people, horses, coal fires, and open sewers to the mix. Stone and brick trapped the day's temperature and gave it back at night with compound interest. Streets that had baked under direct sun for 12 hours radiated warmth well past midnight. In New York, Chicago, and London, summer heat wasn't a seasonal inconvenience. It was a public health emergency that killed real people in real numbers. The urban heat island effect, the well-documented phenomenon by which cities are measurably hotter than the surrounding countryside, was operating in full force in the pre-AC era, even if no one had a name for it yet. The mechanisms were straightforward and relentless. Dark surfaces, asphalt, cobblestone, brick, absorbed solar radiation efficiently and released it slowly. Buildings blocked the wind that might have cooled street-level air. Human activity, cooking, industry, the metabolic output of a large concentrated population added heat. Animals added more. In an era when horses were the primary mode of urban transportation, tens of thousands of large warm-blooded mammals moving through city streets all day contributed meaningfully to the thermal environment in ways that are difficult to appreciate now. The smell of summer cities was its own particular feature of the era. Without refrigeration, food spoiled faster. Without adequate waste removal infrastructure, and most 19th century cities were still working out the basics of sanitation. The combination of human waste, animal waste, rotting organic matter, and standing water and summer heat created an olfactory environment that contemporary accounts describe in terms ranging from merely unpleasant to genuinely harrowing. Miasma theory, the idea that disease was transmitted through bad air, specifically the kind produced by rotting organic matter, was wrong about the mechanism, but not wrong about the association. Cities in summer smelled badly, and people died of things connected to that smell, even if the smell itself wasn't the direct cause. Working-class neighborhoods were the worst. Tenement blocks in cities like New York were built to maximize the number of units on a given lot, which meant minimal space between buildings, minimal cross-ventilation, and maximum density of people in the hottest possible built environment. A family of 5 or 6 people in a 2-room apartment on the 4th floor of a brick tenement on a July night in 1890 was facing a combination of circumstances: heat radiating from walls and ceiling, body heat from multiple people in a small enclosed space, no mechanical air movement, and windows that opened onto an air shaft rather than any actual exterior air that was not merely uncomfortable but genuinely dangerous. Wealthier residents escaped the city in summer, or at least retreated to better ventilated homes in less dense neighborhoods. Middle-class families with the means to do so took vacations to coastal or mountain resorts. The poor stayed because they had nowhere else to go and could not afford to go there. Summer in the city was, above everything else, a class experience, experienced very differently depending on how much money you had and what options that money bought you, ranging from minor discomfort for the wealthy to genuine mortal risk for the very poor. The geography of summer suffering mapped almost perfectly onto the geography of poverty, and nobody in power considered this a particular policy priority until heat waves started generating body counts large enough to make the newspapers. In August of 1896, a heat wave settled over New York City and stayed for 10 days. The temperature climbed above 90 degrees and refused to come down at night, when the tenements and row houses of lower Manhattan became literal ovens, radiating back everything the sun had poured into them. More than 1,500 people died. The very young, the very old, the poor, and the already ill went first. Horses collapsed in the streets. City ice ran out. Jacob Riis and Theodore Roosevelt both wrote about it, because what happened in those 10 days was not weather. It was catastrophe. The heat wave of 1896 arrived with very little warning, as heat waves did in an era before meteorological forecasting had developed anything like its modern capabilities. There were no heat advisories, no emergency broadcasts, no official systems for identifying and reaching the most vulnerable populations in advance. The temperature rose and kept rising, and the city's institutions were not organized to respond to it as a crisis in the way they might respond to a flood or a fire. It was just hot. It had been hot before, and then people started dying in numbers that could not be ignored. Theodore Roosevelt was serving as New York City's police commissioner at the time. He opened police station houses as refuge points where people could come to escape the heat, a practical response, but one that underscored how completely unprepared the city's formal institutions were for the scale of what was happening. He also arranged for the city to distribute ice to poor neighborhoods in Lower Manhattan, where the death toll was most concentrated. The ice, when it arrived, was received with a desperation that communicated everything about what the preceding days had been like in those blocks. People lined up for it. Children were sent to wait in line for it. It was ice, and it was necessary, and there was not enough of it. Jacob Riis, who had spent years documenting life in New York's tenements, wrote about the heat wave with the particular authority of someone who already knew those buildings and what they were like in ordinary summer heat. The tenements of the Lower East Side, already inadequate in normal summer conditions, became unbearable in the heat wave. Families who ordinarily retreated to fire escapes or rooftops for sleeping were now doing so even during the day. Stoops and sidewalks were occupied all night by people who could not bear to be inside. The streets, ordinarily a source of noise and activity, became instead a kind of outdoor sick ward, crowded with people who were suffering and had nowhere else to go. The death toll accumulated in a pattern that was, even at the time, clearly not random. The elderly died first, their bodies less able to regulate temperature under physiological stress. Infants and very young children followed, their small bodies overwhelmed by heat they could not communicate and could not escape. Men who had been working outdoors or in hot industrial environments all day arrived home already compromised, and the inability to cool down through the night finished what the day had started. The newspapers counted the bodies and reported the numbers with a kind of grim arithmetic, and the numbers kept rising for 10 days. When the temperature finally broke, the city exhaled with collective relief that was also immediately a reckoning. 1,500 dead in 10 days was too many to absorb as simply weather. Questions were asked about what the city owed its poorest residents in conditions of extreme heat. Questions that were partially answered, imperfectly and incompletely, and then largely forgotten until the next heat wave came and the same questions had to be asked again. The heat wave of 1896 was not the last time New York's summer killed its most vulnerable people in large numbers. It was, however, one of the first times anyone in authority was paying enough attention to count. Fashion in the 19th century did not compromise for summer. Women wore layers, chemise, corset, petticoats, dress, sometimes a jacket, in fabrics that did not breathe, in colours that absorbed heat, in styles that covered everything from the neck to the floor. Men wore wool suits. Children were dressed as miniature adults and sent into the sun. The idea that one might dress for the weather, reduce layers, expose skin to the air, this was not generally considered acceptable until well into the 20th century, and some people sweated their way through entire summers in full, formal dress on principle. The logic behind this clothing, such as it was, had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with social legibility. What you wore communicated who you were, what class you belonged to, whether you were respectable or not. Respectable people wore complete clothing. Complete clothing meant layers, and layers meant that summer was, among other things, a test of social commitment, an ongoing demonstration that you cared more about how you appeared to the world than about whether the world was currently trying to cook you alive. People passed this test every day, visibly sweating through their wool and their pride, and considered the sweating a private matter that had nothing to do with the clothes. Wool was the dominant fabric of the era for outer garments, and wool in summer is a special category of suffering that requires direct experience to fully understand. Wool traps moisture. It is heavy when dry and heavier when damp. It does not release heat efficiently. It holds its shape through repeated contact with a sweating human body in ways that linen and cotton do not, which is part of why it was preferred for tailored garments. A wool suit held its cut, maintained its silhouette, looked authoritative on a man regardless of what that man's body was doing inside it. What that man's body was doing inside it in August, in an era before deodorant had been commercialized, was something nobody discussed in polite company, and everyone understood implicitly. Women's clothing was, if anything, more burdensome. The Victorian and Edwardian layering system, undergarments, stays or corset, petticoat or petticoats plural, the dress itself, potentially a jacket or bodice over that, created a thermal environment around the female body in summer that was genuinely dangerous by modern medical standards. Women fainted with statistical regularity during summer months and at outdoor events, and while fainting was culturally coded as a sign of feminine delicacy, its actual cause was frequently heat and restricted breathing. The corset limited the expansion of the lungs. The layers prevented the evaporation of sweat. The hat, mandatory outdoors, blocked any cooling from air movement across the scalp. It was a complete system for thermal entrapment, executed in silk and whalebone and social expectation. Children were not exempted from this logic, which is its own particular variety of cruelty. Boys wore wool suits with long pants and jackets. Girls wore dresses over petticoats with pinafores on top. Babies were swaddled in layers that would cause modern paediatricians to reach for the phone. The reasoning was partly cultural. Children dressed as small adults signalled their family's respectability, and partly genuinely protective in an era when sunburn was a real danger, and skin exposure invited insect bites and worse. The fact that it also meant that children were uncomfortably, sometimes dangerously hot. All summer was considered a secondary concern relative to the social and practical benefits of covering them completely. Reform came slowly. The rational dress movement of the late 19th century argued, sensibly and largely without success at the time, that women's clothing should allow normal breathing and movement. Lighter summer fabrics, lawn, voile, lightweight cotton muslin became more acceptable for informal summer wear by the early 20th century. And then the First World War, which removed millions of men from offices and put them in field conditions, and millions of women into factories and active roles, applied practical pressure to clothing conventions that social arguments had never quite managed to dislodge. By the 1920s, hemlines were rising and layers were coming off. Not quickly enough to help anyone who had been wearing wool in August in 1890, but eventually. Let's take a specific moment here and consider the corset in summer. The Victorian and Edwardian corset was constructed from whalebone, steel and heavy fabric, laced tight across the torso and worn under every other layer a woman put on her body. In winter, it was uncomfortable. In summer, it was a commitment to a level of physical endurance that most modern people would not survive. Women fainted, and this was considered a medical condition of feminine delicacy, not evidence that someone was being strangled by their own clothing in 90-degree heat. The corset had been reshaping women's torso since at least the 16th century, and by the Victorian era it had reached a kind of peak engineering in terms of both its effectiveness and its ability to cause harm. The goal was a specific silhouette, a narrow waist, an elevated bust, an overall vertical compression of the midsection that was considered not merely fashionable but morally indicative. A tightly laced corset signalled self-discipline, feminine propriety, and adherence to the social values of the era. Loosening your corset was in certain circles essentially a character statement, and not a positive one. In summer, putting this garment on every morning was an act of either remarkable social commitment or the complete absence of alternatives. The corset was not optional for respectable women of any class in the 19th century. Working-class women wore simpler, less constricting versions, but they wore something. Middle and upper-class women wore the full construction, laced to the fashionable tightness of the day, and then proceeded to live their entire summer lives inside it. Cooking, visiting, shopping, attending social events, performing all of the domestic and social labour that constituted a woman's day in this era, all of it done in a garment that compressed the lungs and generated its own microclimate of trapped heat against the skin. The physical consequences were well documented even by contemporary physicians, who managed the interesting feat of identifying the corset as a medical problem while simultaneously recommending it as a form of back support and moral hygiene. Women who wore tightly laced corsets regularly developed compressed organs, displaced ribs, and a dependence on the external structure for posture that made removing the corset feel destabilizing. The muscles that might otherwise support the torso had, in many cases, been partially relieved of that duty by the corset for so long that their absence felt genuinely uncomfortable. The corset had created the need for itself. In summer heat, the fabric of the corset against the skin became saturated with sweat within an hour of dressing. The steel and whalebone stays conducted heat. The tightness of the lacing restricted the deep breathing that might have helped regulate body temperature. When a woman fainted, and fainting among tightly corseted women in summer heat was common enough to be considered routine rather than alarming, the prescribed treatment was to loosen the corset lacing, which is a fairly explicit acknowledgement that the lacing was part of the problem. The treatment was then to relace once the woman had recovered, because the problem, apparently, was the fainting, not the cause of the fainting. Reform advocates who targeted the corset specifically, like the dress reform movements of the 1880s and 90s, did make gradual progress. The Edwardian corset was somewhat less compressive than its Victorian predecessor. By the 1910s, the silhouette fashion demanded had shifted, and the corset moved with it towards something slightly less vertical. And then the 20s arrived. Hemlines climbed, waists dropped, and the rigid boned corset more or less dissolved into foundation garments that caused their own problems, but were at least not actively preventing full respiration. Summer clothing became something a person could breathe in. Progress in this case smelled like relief, and it arrived about a century later than anyone should have needed it to. Before air conditioning changed the geography of American commerce, cooking in summer was a calculated act of controlled misery, and American domestic architecture actually evolved around the problem. The summer kitchen, a separate outbuilding or detached room behind the main house, existed specifically to keep the heat of an active stove away from the living spaces. You walked outside to cook your meals. In the south, this was standard. In the north, it was common. The wood-burning or coal-burning stove could push the temperature of a kitchen past 120 degrees on a July afternoon, and keeping that heat out of the house was worth the inconvenience of doing your cooking in a shed. The wood or coal-burning stove was the central appliance of the 19th century kitchen, and it was, by modern standards, a generator of extraordinary and indiscriminate heat. It ran all day when meals were being prepared, and running it was not optional. It was the only means of cooking, of heating water, of doing the kitchen work that kept a household functioning. In winter, a stove running all day was a feature, not a bug. In summer, it was a monthly test of sanity. A large hot iron object in the room where you spent most of your working hours, elevating the temperature of that room to levels that would qualify today as an occupational hazard. The summer kitchen solved this problem by removing the stove from the main house entirely. In its most basic form, it was a small outbuilding, sometimes no more than a shed, with a chimney, a door, and a stove. In more elaborate versions, particularly on prosperous farms and southern plantations, it was a proper secondary kitchen, well-equipped, functional, with workspace and storage, connected to the main house by a covered walkway, so that food could be carried from stove to table without full exposure to the elements. The separation was architectural common sense. Keep the fire outside, and the house stays livable. The women who did the cooking spent their days in the outbuilding regardless. but the rest of the household could move through the main house without the accumulated heat of 6 hours of active cooking. In cities, where the luxury of a separate outbuilding was rarely available, cooking in summer meant opening every window in the kitchen, working as quickly as possible during the cooler morning hours, and preparing cold foods in the afternoon when running the stove was literally unbearable. Cold meals, salads, sliced meat from the morning's cooking, bread, preserved foods became the default summer afternoon and evening strategy, not from any preference for cold food, but from the physical impossibility of generating more heat in a kitchen that was already past 90 degrees by 3 in the afternoon. Cold preparation had its own techniques and traditions. Pickling and preserving, done during cooler hours or in the relative coolness of the basement, extended foods without requiring heat at the time of eating. Icebox desserts, cold puddings, jellies set with gelatin, iced creams and frozen desserts made with purchased ice became fashionable in the late 19th century, specifically because they involved the cold rather than the fire. A summer recipe book from 1880 reads, in retrospect, as a document about managing a heat crisis through culinary strategy. Cold soups, no-cook preparations, make-ahead dishes, things that required the stove for 30 minutes rather than 2 hours. The summer kitchen survived in American domestic architecture through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, fading as gas stoves became available, and then as electric ranges spread the premise that a stove didn't have to be a furnace. Gas ranges were dramatically cooler to operate than wood or coal, electric ranges cooler still. And then air conditioning arrived to make the whole conversation moot, because if the kitchen was climate controlled to 72 degrees, it didn't particularly matter what the stove was doing to the local air temperature. The summer kitchen became a storage room, then a curiosity, then a historic feature that preservation-minded homeowners restored because it was charming. What it had been, for the people who built it and used it, was a practical solution to an impossible problem. The heat of cooking had to go somewhere. They put it outside, and everyone inside was very glad. Summer eating was dictated by spoilage as much as appetite. Meat went bad fast and was either salted, smoked, preserved, or eaten the same day it was slaughtered. Fresh milk lasted hours in summer heat. Butter liquefied. Anything delicate was a race against time. People ate simply, seasonally, and with a cautious relationship to leftovers that modern people with their refrigerators cannot fully appreciate. The arrival of summer produce, corn, tomatoes, stone fruits, was both a pleasure and a logistical challenge, because the same heat that grew the food also destroyed it within days of harvest. Meat was the central anxiety. In the days before refrigeration, the management of meat in summer required a combination of timing, technique, and acceptance of certain risks that modern food safety standards would find alarming. A household that slaughtered a pig or a chicken in July needed to eat it quickly, salt what could be salted, smoke what could be smoked, and discard the rest before it became the kind of problem that expressed itself as a medical emergency 2 days later. Butchers in cities sold what they could in the morning, kept the rest in whatever cooling they had, and watched carefully through the afternoon as summer heat did its inevitable work. The phrase eating something that turned was a genuine category of experience, not a metaphor. Milk was arguably even more precarious. A bucket of fresh milk drawn in the morning was drinkable for a matter of hours in summer heat before the bacteria present in unpasteurized milk reached concentrations that made it dangerous. Pasteurization, which would make milk reliably safe, was not widely adopted in American cities until the early 20th century, meaning that for most of the 19th century, fresh summer milk was a game of timing and luck, that the very young, infants and small children dependent on it for nutrition lost with tragic regularity. Families who could afford it kept their milk in a spring house or ice box. Those who couldn't drink it quickly used it for cooking immediately, or let it curdle into something that was at least stable if no longer appetizing. The seasonality of pre-refrigeration eating was absolute in ways that the modern grocery store with its Chilean blueberries in January has made nearly impossible to imagine. You ate what was growing. In summer, this meant an abundance of fresh vegetables and fruits that appeared, peaked, and vanished in quick succession. Early corn gave way to late corn, early tomatoes to late ones, peaches to apples as summer moved toward fall. There was a specific pleasure to this, an intensity of seasonal eating that people who lived through it often recalled fondly, the way that anything you can only have for 3 weeks tastes better than the same thing available year-round. But there was also the pressure of it, the need to eat the tomatoes now, to can the peaches today, to get the corn off the cob and preserve before it lost its peak. Summer eating was beautiful and relentless in equal measure. Preservation was the technology that bridged summer's abundance to winter's scarcity, and it occupied a significant portion of every summer household's labour. Canning, pickling, drying, smoking and salting were not hobbies or lifestyle choices, they were necessities, the food security infrastructure of a household that knew winter was coming and had to prepare for it during the months when production was at its height. Women and older children spent entire August days putting up tomatoes, making preserves, pickling cucumbers, drying beans, and corn. The summer kitchen ran at full capacity during canning season, adding the steam of boiling water baths to the already oppressive July heat. It was exhausting, hot, and entirely non-optional. What people did not eat much of in summer, if they were being cautious, was anything left over from yesterday. The calculus of leftovers before refrigeration was ruthlessly practical. Food cooked in the morning might be acceptable by noon, but questionable by evening and unacceptable by the following morning. Food prepared the previous day was a risk assessment, not a convenience. People who ate thoughtlessly from yesterday's pot in summer paid for it in ways that kept them close to home for several days. The expression letting something go had a very specific and immediate meaning in a pre-refrigeration summer kitchen, and the wisdom of not letting things go was the kind of practical knowledge passed from mother to daughter as seriously as any other survival skill. Before the backyard pool, before the public recreation centre, before the air-conditioned mall, people had rivers and ponds and the ocean, and in cities public bathing houses and later municipal pools, though the politics of who was allowed to use them and when is its own grim chapter in American history. Children swam in rivers and were occasionally electrocuted by submerged trolley cables, which tells you something about the desperation involved. Adults waded into the ocean fully clothed in bathing costumes that weighed as much as small dogs. Relief was sought wherever it could be found. The river was the original public pool, free and democratic in ways that its later municipal replacement frequently was not. In the summers of the 19th century, rivers running through or near American cities were major sites of summer activity. Swimming, wading, simply standing in the current and letting the cold water do its work. Children swam in whatever state of undress the local norms permitted, which varied considerably by neighbourhood and by who was watching. Men swam in more formal arrangements. Women navigated the question of public water cooling, with the additional constraint of clothing requirements that made the whole enterprise somewhat more complicated than it needed to be. The bathing costume of the Victorian and Edwardian era was a garment of historical comedy that managed the impressive feat of making women less buoyant while covering them more completely. Wool or flannel dresses extending to the knee, often with bloomers beneath, weighted down by water and designed to prevent the viewing of the female form from any angle. Women entering the ocean or a lake in these costumes were not swimming so much as conducting a careful, fully clothed wading experiment while attempting to stay upright against the current. The cooling effect was real. Any contact with cold water reduced body temperature. But the experience was not exactly swimming in any athletic sense. Public bathing establishments appeared in American cities in the mid-19th century as a response to the combination of summer heat, inadequate home bathing facilities, and the growing public health awareness that people needed to wash, and that not everyone had the means to do it privately. These establishments offered both bathing facilities and, in summer, something approaching swimming. They were typically gender segregated, class stratified by price and location, and, in the American context, frequently racially segregated as well. The question of who had access to cool water in summer was never simply a question of geography or money. It was a question of who the managing institutions considered entitled to relief, and the answers to that question followed the usual fault lines of American social organization. Municipal outdoor pools, which spread through American cities in the early 20th century, brought the question of summer water access into direct confrontation with the politics of public space. Pools built in white neighborhoods were typically off-limits to black residents through a combination of official policy and unofficial violence, incidents of white swimmers physically preventing black children from entering pools they were legally entitled to use were common enough to constitute a distinct feature of American summer history in the 1920s through 40s. The desegregation of public pools, when it came, was met with the same organized resistance that desegregation of other public spaces generated, because access to cool water in summer was understood by everyone involved to be a genuine and valuable resource, not merely a symbolic one. Children, meanwhile, made their own arrangements. Urban rivers, drainage ditches, fire hydrants opened by neighborhood kids on hot afternoons. The spray from street cleaning trucks, any available source of moving water, became a cooling technology of improvisation. The opened fire hydrant became an iconic image of American urban summer, specifically because it represented a form of public water access that couldn't be segregated or priced, an infrastructure element whose summer cooling use was officially discouraged and practically universal. You opened the hydrant, the water came out cold, the heat was, for a few minutes, no longer winning. Everyone in the spray understood this as victory. The electric fan was invented in 1882 by Schuyler Wheeler, and while it did absolutely nothing to lower the temperature of a room, it was immediately understood as a gift from God. Moving air felt cooler than still air. This was physics, and physics was suddenly very popular. Fans spread through middle and upper-class homes in the 1890s and 1900s, then into offices and stores. They were not air conditioning. They were hot air, relocated continuously at speed. But they were something, and something was everything, and people were deeply grateful for them in a way that is difficult to explain to anyone who has never sat in genuine, still, 90-degree heat and waited for it to end. The science behind why moving air feels cool is straightforward but worth stating, because it explains both the fan's genuine value and its genuine limitations. When air moves across skin, it accelerates the evaporation of sweat, and evaporation is a cooling process. It draws heat from the skin surface and carries it away. Still air, once it has absorbed as much moisture as it can hold, stops accepting more and the sweating body's main cooling mechanism stalls. Moving air, even hot moving air, keeps evaporation happening, keeps the cooling working, keeps the body's thermoregulation functioning. This is real, measurable, and significant relief. What it is not is a reduction in ambient temperature. The room is still 90 degrees. You're simply better equipped to tolerate 90 degrees than you would be in still air. Early electric fans were luxury items, available primarily to households with money and electric service, a combination that, in the 1880s and 90s, meant primarily wealthy urban homes. The first domestic fans were single-speed, typically oscillating, made of brass or steel with wooden or rubber blades. They were sold at prices that put them out of reach of most working-class households, and they required the electrical infrastructure that was still being built out across American cities. A household in Boston or New York that had electric lighting by 1890 was a relatively prosperous one, and a fan in that household was one more signal of that prosperity, along with the lights themselves. As electrical infrastructure spread and manufacturing costs declined through the early 20th century, fans became democratized, following the same curve that most appliances follow when they move from luxury to necessity. By the 1910s and 20s, small electric fans were available at reasonable prices, present in offices and workshops, used on factory floors where the heat of industrial processes combined with the heat of summer to create working conditions that were, by any measure, dangerous. A fan on a factory floor did not solve the heat problem, but it made it survivable enough that workers continued showing up, which from the factory owner's perspective was the relevant metric. The ceiling fan, which predated the electric era in the form of the punka, a large manually operated swinging fan used in colonial India and the American South, pulled by a servant or a rope system, became a popular electric installation as the technology spread. The ceiling fan moved air through an entire room rather than directing a stream at a single-seated person, and in rooms with any height at all, it created the circulation that made a space feel significantly more tolerable than the same room without it. Restaurants and saloons installed them. Hotels installed them. Theatres, those early adopters of every cooling technology, installed them before the mechanical refrigeration systems that would eventually become air conditioning were widely available. The fan era, from roughly 1882 until air conditioning became a mass-market technology in the 1950s, produced its own culture of heat management, a whole set of behaviours and habits organised around making the best of moving hot air. You positioned the fan to create cross-ventilation with an open window. You placed a bowl of ice in front of it, which genuinely did cool the air slightly as the ice sublimated. You angled it upward at night to push the warm air that had pooled near the ceiling down and away. You knew which rooms in your house the fan worked best in, and which were hopeless regardless. You developed, in short, a relationship with your fan that was practical, personal, and slightly desperate. The relationship of someone who has been given a tool that is genuinely helpful, but is not quite the tool they actually need. Before air conditioning changed the geography of American commerce, offices in summer were theatres of quiet suffering. Clerks in their wool suits, women in their high-collared blouses, everyone at their desks in the radiating heat of stone and brick buildings, doing arithmetic and correspondence with sweat-dampened hands. Ink ran, paper curled. Concentration wavered somewhere around 2 in the afternoon when the building had absorbed its full quota of July and was giving it all back at once. Productivity dropped, mistakes increased, and everyone pretended this was normal because there was nothing else to do. The commercial office building of the 19th and early 20th century was, structurally, the worst possible place to spend a summer afternoon. Built of masonry, designed to be imposing and permanent rather than comfortable, lit by gas or early electric light, it had none of the architectural features that made the better designed domestic buildings of the same era tolerable in heat. There were no sleeping porches, no summer kitchens, no screened verandas. There was the building, and it was hot, and you sat in it from 9 to 5 regardless. Ventilation was the main variable that distinguished a tolerable office summer from an unbearable one, and ventilation was almost entirely at the mercy of building orientation, window placement, and the behaviour of the specific summer's weather. A building that happened to face the prevailing breeze, with operable windows on both sides allowing cross-ventilation, could achieve something approaching air movement on days when the wind cooperated. A building that faced the wrong direction, or whose windows opened onto light wells or other buildings rather than open air, was simply a trap. Workers in such buildings spent summer afternoons in genuine physical distress, trying to maintain the concentration required for clerical or commercial work while their bodies were directing all available resources toward the more urgent problem of not overheating. The physical mechanics of office work in heat were their own particular obstacle. Penmanship, which was a professional skill in an era when business correspondence was written by hand, deteriorated when hands were damp. Steel-nibbed pens skipped and blotted when moisture from the writer's hand was transferred to the paper. Ink dried inconsistently in humid summer air, sometimes smearing across correspondence that had taken considerable care to compose. Ledgers and account books, kept meticulously by hand in an era before mechanical calculation, required a precision of writing that the combination of heat and sweat actively worked against. A bookkeeper in August in a brick office building in Chicago was trying to maintain 18th century standards of penmanship under conditions that would have embarrassed a Roman legion on campaign. Bosses and managers adapted to the extent that business culture would allow. Some offices shortened summer hours, beginning earlier in the morning when the building was still relatively cool and closing before the peak afternoon heat. Some allowed the removal of jackets, a small concession that was, given the alternative, enormously significant. Some installed fans as soon as they became available, accepting the noise and the modest relief they provided. Others maintained full formal dress codes and full summer hours and watched their workers deteriorate through July and August with the particular stoicism of people who believed that acknowledging the heat was worse than pretending it didn't exist. The real solution, when it came, arrived unexpectedly in the form of the movie theatre. Theatre owners, who had discovered in the 1920s that mechanical cooling systems increased summer attendance dramatically, created the model that office building owners would eventually follow. If you cooled the building, people would stay in it, work in it, pay to be in it. The translation of this discovery from commercial entertainment to commercial office space took longer than it should have, held back by the cost of installation and the conservative habits of industries that had managed summer productivity poorly for generations and considered this normal. When air conditioning finally arrived in office buildings in the 1930s and 40s, the transformation was immediate and complete. People could think in August. The paper stopped curling. The ink behaved. Productivity in summer, for the first time in the history of indoor work, became comparable to productivity in any other season. It was considered miraculous by the people who experienced it, and it was. Wealthy Americans discovered early that the solution to urban summer heat was to simply leave, and from this discovery grew an entire industry. Newport, Rhode Island, Saratoga Springs, New York, Bar Harbor, Maine, Cape May, New Jersey. These were not vacation destinations in the modern sense. They were retreats from a seasonal catastrophe, places where money bought elevation, ocean breezes and physical separation from the hot, sick, dying city below. The summer resort was born from necessity and became a monument to class, a place where the rich went to breathe and everyone else stayed behind and suffered elegantly. The geography of the American summer resort circuit followed the physics of natural cooling with considerable precision. The ocean was cooler than the interior. Mountains were cooler than valleys. Elevation reduced temperature at a rate of roughly 3 to 5 degrees per 1,000 feet. Newport, sitting on an island in Rhode Island Sound, caught the Atlantic breeze that made July there several degrees cooler than Boston 20 miles inland. Bar Harbor, on the Maine coast, was dramatically cooler than New York or Philadelphia in summer, a different season entirely, almost autumnal in August, with mornings so cool you needed a coat on the veranda. Saratoga Springs offered both elevation and the additional attraction of mineral springs, whose therapeutic properties were extensively and creatively claimed by everyone from physicians to resort operators. The cool air was real. The mineral cures were more negotiable. What made these places function as resorts, rather than simply as cool locations, was the infrastructure of leisure that grew up around the wealthy summer population. Grand hotels, and the great American resort hotel of the late 19th century was genuinely grand, with piazzas stretching the length of the building to catch every available breeze, dining rooms that seated hundreds, orchestras performing on summer evenings, organised the social life of the seasonal migration. You came to Newport for the ocean air, but you stayed, and came back year after year for the social season that the concentration of wealthy families generated. Newport in the 1880s was, for the people who belonged to it, less a place than an institution, a temporary city of the privileged, assembled each summer and dismantled each September. The cottage culture that developed alongside the great hotels was its own statement about summer and class. Wealthy families who came to Newport or Bar Harbour every summer built seasonal residences called cottages with deliberate understatement, though many were effectively mansions that they occupied for 3 months and left empty for 9. The Vanderbilt cottages at Newport were not cottages by any reasonable definition. They were 70-room palaces built for seasonal use by families whose permanent urban homes were already palatial. The investment in summer comfort was, in other words, essentially unlimited for the people at the very top of the social hierarchy. They did not simply escape the heat. They built elaborate seasonal alternate lives organised around the fact of the heat, turning the summer calendar into a parallel social season with its own rituals, hierarchies, and competitive displays. For the people who served this summer economy, the hotel workers, the domestic staff in the cottages, the tradespeople and service workers who kept the resort towns functioning, the summer was work rather than escape, and the work was performed in the same heat that the guests had left the city to avoid. Newport in August might have been 10 degrees cooler than New York, but 10 degrees of relief did not transform dishwashing or laundry or road maintenance into comfortable labour. The resort towns depended on a workforce that could not afford to be there as visitors and had no particular reason to love the people who could. The summer idyll of the wealthy was, like most such idylls, built on the invisible labour of people for whom idyll was not on offer. The history of summer heat before air conditioning is also, inescapably, a history of inequality. The wealthy left. The middle class improvised. The poor stayed and endured. Tenement apartments in New York's Lower East Side could house a family of 8 in 2 rooms, the windows facing a courtyard that offered no breeze, the walls holding the day's heat long past midnight, the children sleeping on fire escapes or rooftops out of desperation rather than adventure. Summer mortality rates in poor urban neighbourhoods were catastrophically higher than in wealthier ones. The heat did not treat everyone the same, and it never did. The tenement building was an architecture of extraction, designed to produce maximum rental income from minimum land, at minimum expense, with minimum consideration for the people who would live in it. A typical New York tenement of the late 19th century was 4 to 6 stories tall, approximately 25 feet wide and 90 feet deep, containing between 12 and 20 apartments per floor depending on the configuration. Each apartment might contain 2 or 3 small rooms. A family of 5 or 6 people in 2 rooms in summer, in a building whose walls absorbed heat all day, and whose courtyard or air shaft provided essentially no ventilation, was living in conditions that a temperature-controlled facility of any kind would not have permitted for any purpose. The dumbbell tenement, which became the standard New York form after a housing reform competition in 1879, was specifically designed to address ventilation concerns by introducing a narrow indentation on each side of the building that created an air shaft between adjacent buildings. The theory was that these shafts would provide light and air to the interior rooms. In practice, a 4-inch wide shaft between two buildings in a dense city block provided neither light nor air in any meaningful quantity. It collected garbage, amplified sound between neighbouring apartments, and channeled odours between floors while doing almost nothing for ventilation. It was a design solution to a political problem rather than an architectural one, and it failed at the task it was supposed to accomplish while succeeding at demonstrating that the problem had been considered. Workers who spent their days in hot industrial environments, laundries, bakeries, iron foundries, glass factories, tanneries, returned to apartments that offered no recovery from that heat. The laundry worker, who had spent 10 hours over vats of boiling water in a commercial laundry, came home to a 2-room apartment where the temperature at 10 in the evening was still above 90 degrees and the children were crying from the heat on the floor. There was no cool room to go to, no second space with better ventilation, no alternative sleeping arrangement that materially improved the situation. You opened the windows and hoped, and if there was no breeze, you lay in the dark and waited for a morning that arrived already warm. The consequence of all this was measured in bodies, specifically in the bodies of infants and children. Summer infant mortality in poor urban neighbourhoods in the 1880s and 90s was so extreme that it shaped the actuarial tables of insurance companies, the reporting patterns of city newspapers, and eventually the reform priorities of the progressive movement. Doctors who practiced in poor neighbourhoods knew summer as the killing season, the months when the combination of heat, contaminated water, spoiled food, and respiratory illness took children who had survived the winter and filled the graveyard sections reserved for the small. This was not considered at the time a policy failure in the same way that it would be considered today. It was considered the natural consequence of poverty. The distinction between what was natural and what was preventable would take several more decades of progressive advocacy, public health reform and political organising to establish, and even then the establishing was incomplete. Infant mortality in summer was a seasonal horror that 19th and early 20th century families accepted with a grim matter-of-factness that modern parents find incomprehensible. The combination of heat, contaminated water, spoiled milk, and inadequate sanitation turned summer into the most dangerous season for children under 2. Summer complaint, a catch-all term for diarrheal disease exacerbated by heat, killed tens of thousands of infants annually in American cities in the decades before refrigeration, pasteurization, and clean water infrastructure arrived to change the math. The phrase summer complaint covered a range of conditions whose common feature was intestinal illness in infants and young children during hot weather, and whose common cause was bacteria thriving in conditions that the summer heat was extraordinarily good at producing. Unpasteurized milk left at room temperature for any period of time was a bacterial culture, medium of considerable efficiency. Water from municipal supplies contaminated by inadequate sewage separation did its own work. Food prepared in warm conditions and not eaten immediately contributed. A mother in a tenement apartment in July, managing an infant's feeding with no reliable cold storage, no access to clean water she could trust, and no way to ensure that the milk she was giving her child had not crossed the line from nourishing to dangerous, was navigating risks that she could not quantify and could not avoid. Breastfeeding offered significant protection because breast milk did not require storage or cooling and arrived free of the external contamination that made cow's milk so dangerous in summer. Women who were able to breastfeed their infants through the summer gave them a meaningful advantage. But breastfeeding was not always possible. Maternal illness, inadequate nutrition, employment that required mothers to be away from infants for extended periods all interfered, and the alternatives in the pre-pasteurization era were variably dangerous. Feeding bottles of the period were difficult to clean thoroughly, harbouring bacteria in their rubber nipples and narrow necks that repeated washings did not reliably eliminate. A bottle-fed infant in summer in a tenement apartment in 1890 was facing a concentration of risks that modern paediatric medicine would describe as a crisis. The response of public health reformers, when it came, was practical and life-saving in ways that were immediately and measurably apparent. Milk depots, facilities that distributed clean, inspected or pasteurized milk to mothers in poor neighborhoods at reduced or no cost, appeared in American cities in the 1890s and 1900s. The reduction in infant mortality in neighborhoods served by milk depots was dramatic enough to be statistically significant within a few years, providing some of the earliest clear evidence that the connection between milk quality and infant death was causal rather than merely correlational. Nathan Strauss, a New York merchant and philanthropist, funded milk depots extensively and documented their impact with the particular satisfaction of someone who has found a lever that actually works. Clean water infrastructure, the construction of filtered and treated municipal water systems, had an even larger effect. Typhoid fever, cholera, and other waterborne diseases that peaked in summer hit cities with contaminated water supplies and spared cities with clean ones, with a clarity that was eventually impossible for even skeptical public health officials to argue against. A city that built a filtration plant and saw its summer mortality rates drop measurably had made the argument empirically. The transition from contaminated to clean municipal water in American cities between roughly 1880 and 1920 was one of the most significant public health achievements in American history, and much of its impact was concentrated in summer, in infants, in the poor neighborhoods where the cost of a bad summer had always been highest. Before the icebox, before the refrigerator, before any of it, people kept food cold the way nature provided, underground and in running water. The root cellar, a simple dugout space beneath or beside a house, maintained a fairly stable cool temperature year-round through the insulating properties of the earth itself. Spring houses were built directly over natural springs, the cold-flowing water keeping stored butter, cream, and perishables at temperatures that extended their life by days. These weren't primitive solutions. They were clever, effective, and the product of generations of observation about how the natural world worked. The root cellar was among the oldest food preservation technologies in the human toolkit, predating written records and present in virtually every agricultural culture that experienced warm summers. The principle was elegantly simple: dig down far enough, and the earth becomes a thermal buffer, maintaining temperatures that hover between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the surface is doing. In July, when a kitchen was 90 degrees and a pantry was not much better, a root cellar 6 feet underground was a different climate entirely. Cool, slightly damp, smelling of earth and stored vegetables, maintaining conditions that extended the life of root vegetables, apples and certain preserved foods by weeks or months. Construction was simple enough that most farm families built their own. A hole was dug into a hillside or directly beneath the house, lined with stone or timber to prevent collapse, fitted with a wooden door that kept out vermin and maintained the cool air inside. Ventilation was managed carefully. Too much airflow and the temperature rose with the summer heat above. Too little and moisture accumulated into mould. The ideal root cellar was a compromise between these forces, and experienced farmers knew by feel and smell whether theirs was functioning correctly. The smell of a well-managed root cellar in summer, cool, earthy, slightly sweet from stored apples and root vegetables, was one of the more reliable sensory rewards of agricultural life, a pocket of another season accessible by walking down a short flight of steps. Spring houses were a more specific and more elegant solution, available to farms lucky enough to have a natural spring on their property. A small stone building was constructed directly over the spring, with channels or troughs running through it that guided the cold spring water beneath shelves and storage platforms. Crocks of butter, pitchers of cream, containers of milk and other perishables sat in or beside the flowing water, kept at temperatures that the spring maintained regardless of the season. A good spring house in summer was, by the standards of the era, an extraordinary luxury, genuinely cold food storage, free to operate, requiring only the labour of building and the good fortune of having a spring in the right location. Beyond cellars and spring houses, food preservation strategies included burying items wrapped in wet cloth, storing containers in deep well water, and using the coolness of north-facing rooms that received no direct sunlight. These were partial solutions, helpful at the margins, extending the life of food by hours rather than days compared to what cold water storage could manage, but they were employed wherever proper cooling infrastructure was unavailable. A housewife in a city tenement had no spring house and no root cellar. She had a windowsill on the north side of the building, the cooler of her 2 small rooms, and whatever ingenuity she could apply to the problem of keeping tomorrow's food edible through today's heat. The arrival of the commercial icebox in the early 19th century eventually displaced these older technologies for urban households, and later for rural ones as ice delivery networks expanded. But the root cellar and spring house did not disappear immediately. Farm families who had good cellars and good springs used them alongside purchased ice for decades, because free cold storage was always preferable to paid cold storage, and the earth had been keeping food cold reliably for longer than anyone could remember. The technologies of natural cooling retreated slowly, replaced, not because they failed, but because commercial systems offered something more convenient, more reliable, and available to people who lacked the geological good fortune of a spring on their land. Today, a root cellar is a homesteading choice, a deliberate return to something older. For several thousand years before that, it was simply where you kept the butter. No region of America had to think harder about summer heat than the American South, and no architectural tradition reflects that reckoning more directly. The deep porch, wide, shaded, oriented to catch the prevailing breeze, was not a decorative feature. It was a climate control system. High ceilings in antebellum homes allowed hot air to rise away from the people living below. Tall windows opened from top and bottom to create cross-ventilation. Kitchens were separated from the main house. Trees were planted strategically. The entire built environment was shaped by the imperative of surviving 6 months of subtropical heat with nothing but physics and carpentry. Southern vernacular architecture was, before everything else, a conversation with climate. The people who built houses in Georgia and Mississippi and Louisiana in the 1800s were not making aesthetic choices first and practical ones second. They were solving problems, and the aesthetics followed from the solutions. The wide front porch, which became so iconic a feature of southern domestic life that it eventually came to signify a whole set of cultural values about hospitality and slower living, was originally and primarily a shading device. A porch roof that extended 8 or 10 feet from the house wall blocked the direct sun from the windows and walls behind it, during the middle portion of the day when the sun's angle was most punishing. Shaded walls absorbed less heat. Rooms behind shaded walls were cooler. The math was straightforward and the results were meaningful. The sitting that happened on those porches, the morning coffee, the evening conversations, the long summer afternoons in rocking chairs, was a consequence of the porch's cooling function rather than its cause. You sat on the porch in summer because the porch was bearable, and the interior of the house was not, particularly during the hours between noon and 4 when the sun was direct and the interior was accumulating everything it had absorbed since morning. The porch offered shade, whatever breeze existed, and the psychological relief of being outside in a space that felt open rather than trapped. Southern porch culture was heat management dressed as leisure, and it worked well enough that the practice persisted long after air conditioning made the thermal logic of it unnecessary. Ceiling height was another variable the South took more seriously than northern builders typically did. A room with 14 or 16-foot ceilings in the antebellum South was not an architectural extravagance, it was a thermal buffer. Hot air rises, and a high ceiling gave it somewhere to go that was not directly above the heads of the people occupying the room. The upper reaches of a tall-ceilinged room in summer became the repository for the warmest air, while the lower portion, where people actually lived and breathed, remained marginally cooler. Combined with transom windows above interior doors, openings designed to allow hot air to move between rooms and upward through the house, high ceilings created a passive circulation system that extracted heat slowly and continuously throughout the day. The shotgun house, which became the dominant form for working-class housing across the South, took the ventilation principle to its structural extreme. Rooms were arranged in a straight line from front to back, each opening directly into the next, with a door or window at each end of the sequence. Open both ends, and a breeze moved through the entire house without obstruction, a complete cross-ventilation corridor with no dead-end rooms where heat could accumulate. The name came from the observation that you could fire a shotgun through the front door and the shot would exit the back without hitting a wall, which is a colourful description of a building type that was, in its way, precisely engineered for the climate it inhabited. Trees were infrastructure in the pre-AC South, in ways that modern landscaping rarely approaches. A live oak positioned on the southwest corner of a house blocked the late afternoon sun that would otherwise heat the west-facing walls through the hottest hours of the day. A row of trees along the south side created shade across the yard that reduced ground-level heat and kept the air near the house cooler than it would otherwise be. Families planted trees with the explicit intention of creating shade for their grandchildren, accepting that the investment required decades to mature and making it anyway, because they understood the value of what they were building. The relationship between southern domestic life and its surrounding trees was intimate, practical, and long-term in the best possible sense. Between midnight and 4 a.m, when the sun was gone but the stored heat of buildings and pavement had not yet released, was the most dangerous and miserable period of any serious heat wave. This was the hour when heat stroke crept in, when infants stopped breathing, when men who had laboured all day in the sun simply did not wake up. People who understood this, who had survived enough summers, developed rituals for these hours. The wet cloth laid across the chest, the window opened in a specific way to catch any movement of air, the floor of the kitchen sought as the coolest surface in the house. The physics of what happens to a city at night during a heat wave are worth understanding, because they explain why these hours were so lethal. During the day, solar radiation heats every surface it touches, rooftops, walls, pavement, the soil itself. These surfaces store this energy and then release it slowly through the night, a process called nocturnal heat emission that under normal conditions is responsible for the comfortable cooling that makes summer nights pleasant. During a sustained heat wave, successive days of intense heating load the thermal mass of buildings and streets beyond their normal storage capacity, and the release extends further into the night, sometimes persisting until just before dawn, without bringing temperatures meaningfully below what they were at sunset. For a person inside a building, the worst of this plays out between midnight and 4. The building's walls, still warm from the day, are radiating their stored heat inward. The body, which has been losing heat all day through sweating and is now approaching dehydration, has less cooling reserve available. Sleep, which is the body's normal nighttime state, reduces awareness of distress signals that wakefulness would catch. People fell into the dangerous end of heat illness during these hours and could not rouse themselves from it, particularly the very old, the very young, and anyone already weakened by illness or labour. The people who understood this danger were the ones who stayed awake, who checked on neighbours, who made sure children were as cool as they could be made. The wet cloth was the primary tool of overnight heat management at the individual level, simple, free, and genuinely effective at buying short stretches of relief. A cloth soaked in cool water placed on the forehead, the back of the neck or the chest assisted the body's evaporative cooling in the same way that sweat does, providing additional cooling capacity at the points where major blood vessels ran close to the skin. The effect lasted only as long as the cloth remained cool and damp, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes before it had absorbed as much heat as it could hold and needed to be re-wetted. A person managing this through the night for a child or an elderly relative was essentially running a manual cooling system, replacing the cloth every quarter hour, maintaining the water in a basin nearby, sleeping in broken stretches between interventions. People who had good instincts about the night's worst hours used the window with a sophistication that recognized not just whether it was open, but how it was positioned relative to any air movement outside. Windows on opposite sides of a room open to different degrees could create a directed flow of air through the space, rather than allowing it to stagnate. A window opened from the top, which allowed hot interior air to escape while drawing cooler exterior air in from below, was understood in certain domestic traditions as more effective than one opened fully from the bottom. Whether this folk knowledge was precisely correct in all cases mattered less than the fact that it oriented people toward active problem-solving rather than passive endurance, the difference between doing something about the night and simply suffering through it. By 4 or 5 in the morning, if any relief was coming, it had arrived. The pre-dawn hours were the coolest point of the 24-hour cycle, the one window when the accumulated heat of the day had been fully released, and the next day's solar loading had not yet begun. People who'd been awake through the worst of the night often slept in those last hours before dawn, not because the conditions were good, but because they were finally better than they had been, and the body, having endured the worst, was willing to accept the minimum as sufficient. Before germ theory was widely understood, the connection between summer heat and disease was real but misread. Miasma theory, the idea that disease came from bad air, from rotting organic matter, from the smells of summer, led to obsessive ventilation as a health strategy. People were not wrong that summer killed more people, they were wrong about why. The heat accelerated the very biological processes, bacterial growth, insect reproduction, contaminated water, that spread typhoid, cholera, dysentery, and yellow fever. Summer was not just uncomfortable. Summer was, historically, when cities got sick and people died. The miasma theory was wrong about mechanism but had enough observational truth behind it to be persuasive for centuries. Disease did tend to concentrate in places that smelled bad, the low-lying areas of cities where waste accumulated, the neighbourhoods built over filled-in marshes, the streets where slaughterhouses and tanneries operated. These places were dangerous not because the smell itself caused disease, but because the conditions that produced the smell, decomposing organic matter, standing water, inadequate waste removal, were the same conditions that harboured the bacteria, protozoa and mosquitoes that actually caused it. Following your nose toward danger was empirically a reasonable strategy, even if the theory explaining why was entirely incorrect. Cholera was summer's most spectacular killer. The cholera bacterium thrives in warm water and spreads through contaminated water supplies with an efficiency that made urban outbreaks in the pre-sanitation era genuinely catastrophic. The great cholera pandemics of the 19th century, 1832, 1849, 1866, 1892, all reached their peaks in summer, when warm water temperatures accelerated bacterial growth, and the same infrastructure problems that produced bad smells also contaminated the water supply. A city hit by cholera in July would watch its death toll climb through August and September, and then decline as the temperature dropped and bacterial growth slowed, giving observers the impression that the disease was seasonal in some fundamental way, which it was, just not for the reasons they assumed. Typhoid fever followed a similar seasonal pattern for similar reasons. The typhoid bacterium spread through contaminated water and food, both of which became more dangerous in summer heat. Flies, which could transfer bacteria between fecal matter and food in a single landing, were more numerous and more active in warm weather. Food that sat at room temperature long enough for bacteria to multiply to dangerous concentrations did so much faster in August than in January. A family whose kitchen management was adequate in winter might have the same practices produce a typhoid case in summer, simply because the time required for food to become unsafe had shrunk from hours to minutes. Yellow fever presented a different mechanism but the same seasonal pattern. Transmitted by the Aedes aegypti mosquito, which breeds in standing water and is active only above certain temperatures, yellow fever was a summer disease of southern cities and tropical ports, present only when the mosquito was present, disappearing with the first frost that killed or drove off the insect. New Orleans lost thousands of residents to yellow fever in repeated summer epidemics throughout the 19th century, the death toll in some years exceeding 10% of the city's population. The connection between the disease and the season was obvious. The connection between the disease and the mosquito was not established until 1899, when Walter Reed's work in Cuba identified the vector and opened the way toward the mosquito control campaigns that eventually reduced yellow fever to a manageable threat. What all of these diseases shared was a relationship with summer heat that was genuine, causal, and before germ theory was established, essentially unpreventable by any targeted means. You could ventilate your house, avoid low-lying neighborhoods, flee the city if you could afford to, and pray, and none of these measures addressed the actual biological mechanisms at work. The reduction of summer disease mortality, when it finally came, required clean water, pasteurized milk, screened windows, mosquito control, and eventually vaccines and antibiotics, a package of interventions that arrived gradually between about 1880 and 1940, and transformed summer from the killing season into something merely uncomfortable. In 1902, a 25-year-old engineer named Willis Carrier solved a humidity problem at a printing plant in Brooklyn, New York, and in doing so accidentally invented air conditioning. The machine he designed, intended to control humidity so that paper wouldn't warp and ink wouldn't run, also lowered the temperature of the air. It took decades for this technology to move from industrial use to domestic use, from factories to movie theaters, from office buildings to homes. But when it did, it rewrote the map of human settlement, made the American Sunbelt inhabitable in ways that would have been unthinkable in 1875, and ended quietly and without ceremony the long human reckoning with summer heat. The problem Carrier was asked to solve was specific and commercial rather than humanitarian. The Sackett Wilhelms Lithographing and Publishing Company in Brooklyn was printing colour illustrations, a technically demanding process that required precise registration of multiple ink passes, and finding that summer humidity was causing the paper to expand and contract between passes, throwing off the registration and ruining the work. Carrier was employed by the Buffalo Forge Company and assigned to find a solution. He designed a system that passed air over coils filled with cold water, which both cooled the air and caused moisture to condense out of it, lowering humidity. The humidity problem was solved. The cooling was, in the first instance, a side effect. Carrier quickly grasped that he had built something larger than a printing room dehumidifier. He patented his system in 1906 under the name the apparatus for treating air, and spent the following decades methodically expanding its application into industries where heat and humidity created production problems: tobacco manufacturing, textile mills, pharmaceutical production, food processing. In each case, the business case was made on product quality and process reliability rather than on human comfort. The machines were there to protect the manufacturing process, and the workers inside the cooled buildings benefited incidentally. The translation from industrial to commercial use came through the movie theatre, and the timing was perfect. The film industry of the 1920s was investing heavily in grand urban movie palaces, elaborate, expensive theatres designed to attract middle and upper middle class audiences away from their homes for an evening. Theatre owners discovered that a cooled building in summer was an attraction independent of the film showing in it. People who had spent the day in hot homes and hot offices would pay to sit in a cool building even if the movie was mediocre. Marquees began advertising refrigerated air alongside the feature films. Summer attendance climbed dramatically at theatres with cooling systems. The economic case for the technology was established in a way that every subsequent commercial building owner could evaluate clearly. The domestic market came last and most slowly. Window unit air conditioners became available to American consumers in the 1930s, but they were expensive, required electrical infrastructure that not all homes had, and found their initial customers primarily among the wealthy. The mass market for home air conditioning opened in the 1950s, when rising post-war prosperity, suburban home construction, and declining unit costs created conditions for rapid adoption. Between 1950 and 1960, the number of American homes with air conditioning rose from approximately 900,000 to roughly 8 million. By 1970, nearly half of American homes had it. The transformation compressed into 2 decades what might otherwise have taken half a century. Carrier himself lived to see the beginning of this transformation. He died in 1950, just as the domestic market was beginning to open. He had spent nearly 5 decades building an industry from a single dehumidification problem in a Brooklyn printing plant, and the world he left behind was measurably different from the one he'd entered. Cooler, more productive in summer, more comfortable in ways that his own era would have found extraordinary, and reorganized around the assumption of mechanical cooling in ways that made returning to the pre-AC world essentially unthinkable for the people who had grown up in the new one. In the 1920s and 30s, long before most American homes had air conditioning, the neighborhood movie theater did something radical. It installed it first. This was not entirely altruistic. Theater owners discovered quickly that in summer, people would pay to sit in a cool room regardless of what was on the screen. They hung banners outside advertising refrigerated air. They installed dramatically oversized cooling systems and pointed them directly at the lobby. The American summer movie tradition, still alive today, was born not from any particular love of film, but from the simple, desperate human need to be somewhere that wasn't 90 degrees. The economics were straightforward enough that theatre owners arrived at the same conclusion independently in city after city through the early 1920s. A theatre without cooling struggled for summer audiences. People who might happily attend in October or March were reluctant to sit for 2 hours in a packed enclosed room in July, when the air was already stifling outside and a full house of bodies would make it dramatically worse. Adding mechanical cooling reversed this calculus entirely. The theatre became one of the few places in a city where the air was reliably cooler than outside, and people sought it with a purposefulness that had only a partial relationship to the films being shown. The marketing language that developed around theatre air conditioning was enthusiastic to the point of medical claim. Advertisers described theatre cooling as not merely comfortable, but beneficial, refreshing, restorative, beneficial to health and nerves. Posters showed families emerging from theatres looking revitalised, as though 2 hours of cool air were a medical treatment rather than a commercial transaction. The Carrier Corporation, which supplied many of the early systems, provided theatres with marketing materials emphasising the health angle specifically, because it moved the conversation away from luxury, something that people in the Depression era might feel guilty paying for, toward necessity, which was much easier to justify. The sizing of early theatre cooling systems was deliberately theatrical in its own right. Engineers and theatre owners has discovered that the visible evidence of air conditioning, the sensation of cool air hitting you at the lobby entrance, was a significant part of the product. Systems were sometimes designed to cool the lobby more aggressively than the auditorium itself, creating a dramatic temperature drop at the threshold that communicated the theatre's investment in your comfort before you had even bought your ticket. On a hot August afternoon, that first breath of cool lobby air was a sensory experience people remembered and returned for. It was marketing delivered through the nervous system. The social dimensions of theatre cooling were not simple. Movie palaces of the 1920s were built in downtown commercial districts and attracted racially mixed audiences in cities where other public spaces maintained stricter segregation. The cooling systems that made theatres refugees from summer heat were available, in principle, to anyone who could pay the ticket price, which in some cases made the theatre a more accessible cool space than public parks, pools, or other facilities where access was controlled by social convention or official policy as well as economics. This did not mean the movie theatre was a fully democratic space. Seating was frequently segregated by race in theatres throughout the South and in many northern cities. But the cool air, unlike the seat assignment, did not observe the same distinctions. For children growing up in cities in the 1930s and 40s, the summer movie theatre was the institution of the season, the place you went on the hottest afternoons where you could sit for hours in the cool for the price of a child's ticket, watching double features and cartoons and newsreels, and then the feature again if no one told you to leave. Adults went for the same reasons, dressed in the language of film appreciation. The tradition embedded itself in American culture so thoroughly that it persisted as behaviour, going to summer blockbusters, treating film as a summer activity, long after home air conditioning made the thermal logic of it obsolete. The summer movie was born as heat relief and survived as culture, which is how many American institutions operate. Before industrialized cooling existed for humans, it definitely didn't exist for their animals, and the consequences were everywhere. Urban horses collapsed in the streets during heat waves. This was so common in late 19th century American cities that the removal of dead horses had to be organized as a civic function. Livestock died in fields. Chickens stopped laying. Dogs dug holes in the earth to access cooler ground. The relationship between working animals and summer heat was one of the most visible and brutal faces of the pre-AC world, and the streets of any large American city in August before 1900 were a kind of ongoing outdoor catastrophe. The urban horse was the power source of the 19th century city, pulling streetcars, delivery wagons, carriages, fire engines, and everything else that needed to be moved through a city at speed. New York City in 1880 had approximately 150,000 horses working in it on any given day. Each of these animals was a large, warm-blooded mammal generating its own body heat, working physically in summer temperatures and subject to exactly the same thermal stresses that affected human workers, with the additional disadvantage that nobody had organized a labor movement on their behalf. Heat stroke in horses is a rapid and visible event. An animal that has been working in high heat without adequate water and rest will simply stop and then collapse, with a finality that was hard to ignore when it happened in the middle of a busy street. The removal of dead horses from city streets was a genuine urban logistics problem in the pre-automotive era. A dead draft horse weighed somewhere between 800 and 1,500 pounds and presented a significant obstacle in a roadway that needed to remain passable for commercial traffic. Cities maintained contracts with rendering companies and street cleaning departments to handle removal, and in summer, during heat waves, the volume of calls for dead horse removal increased sharply enough that it overwhelmed normal capacity. Contemporary accounts of New York heat waves in the 1880s and 90s mention dead horses in the streets, not as shocking anomalies but as features of the summer landscape, visible evidence of the same forces that were killing people in the tenements, just more immediately and more publicly apparent. Farm animals outside cities faced summer heat with more space and more access to natural cooling, shade trees, ponds, the cooler temperatures of pre-dawn hours when they could be watered and rested, but the heat still exacted its costs. Dairy cows produce significantly less milk when heat-stressed, a biological response that has been studied extensively by modern agricultural science, but was experienced as simple summer fact by farmers across centuries. Chickens stop laying reliably above certain temperatures, another empirical reality that pre-industrial farmers knew as seasonal rhythm rather than scientific principle. Animals that could find shade used it with an intelligence that required no instruction, seeking the north side of buildings, the shadow under wagons, the edge of any standing water, with the same pragmatic efficiency that characterized their human counterparts. Dogs, being companion animals, allowed closer observation of their coping strategies, demonstrated the earth-cooling principle in miniature. A dog digging into soft ground in summer is accessing the same thermal gradient that the root cellar exploited architecturally. The earth below the surface is cooler than the surface itself, and a few inches of depth can produce a meaningful temperature difference. People watched dogs do this for centuries and drew the entirely correct conclusion that the earth was offering something and built their cellars accordingly. The relationship between observing animal behavior and developing human survival strategies is not often given the credit it deserves, but in the management of summer heat, the dog probably deserves a footnote. The challenge of summer heat is as old as human civilization, and virtually every culture that experienced it developed solutions, architectural, behavioral and culinary, that addressed it with varying degrees of success. The Middle Eastern Qanat, an ancient underground aqueduct system, channeled cool groundwater through homes and cities. Persian wind catchers directed prevailing breezes down into underground rooms. Spanish and Italian cities built their schedules around the midday heat, closing everything from noon to 3 and moving activity to the cooler evening hours. The siesta was not laziness, it was engineering. It was a behavioral adaptation to a physical reality that the human body cannot overpower. The Qanat system of ancient Persia and the broader Middle East is among the most remarkable civil engineering achievements of the ancient world, and one of the least recognized. A Qanat is an underground channel that taps into an aquifer or mountain water source at elevation and conveys water through a gently sloping tunnel to lower ground, sometimes over distances of many miles without any pumping mechanism, powered entirely by gravity and the pressure differential between the water source and the outlet. The groundwater flowing through these tunnels was cool, maintained at the temperature of the deep earth regardless of surface conditions, and where Qanats ran beneath or beside buildings, they functioned as passive cooling systems of considerable effectiveness, reducing interior temperatures through the evaporation of cool water from the channel surface. The Persian wind catcher, or bajir, addressed the cooling problem from above rather than below. A wind catcher is a tower structure, typically rising several meters above the roofline, with openings oriented to catch prevailing winds and channels, directing that airflow downward into the building's interior. The most sophisticated designs incorporated both a windward side that caught the breeze and a leeward side that created a low-pressure zone, drawing hot air upward out of the building while cool air flowed in from below. Some designs combine the wind catcher with a cannet or a pool of water at the base of the channel so that incoming air passed over the cool water surface before entering the living space, providing evaporative cooling in addition to simple ventilation. These systems, developed over centuries of experimentation in some of the world's hottest climates, were producing cooled buildings in the Iranian plateau 2,000 years before Willis Carrier graduated from Cornell. The Mediterranean behavioral response to summer heat, the wholesale reorganization of the daily schedule around the thermal realities of the afternoon, was a solution of different type entirely, operating not on the built environment but on human activity. The custom of closing businesses, retreating indoors, and sleeping during the hottest hours of the day, generally from about noon to 3 or 4 in the afternoon, recognized a physiological fact that modern work schedules have spent a century attempting to override. The human body, in summer heat, is not well suited to productive activity during peak afternoon temperatures. Activity moved to morning and evening, when temperatures were manageable and physical work was possible without the risk of heat illness. This was not a cultural preference, it was a rational adaptation to climate. Indigenous peoples of North America developed architectural and behavioral responses to summer heat that were precisely matched to their specific environments. The adobe construction of the American Southwest, thick earthen walls that absorbed heat slowly during the day and released it slowly at night, created a thermal lag that kept interiors cooler than outside during daylight hours and warmer than outside during cool desert nights. The positioning of dwellings for shade, the use of elevated sleeping platforms that lifted sleepers above the ground-level heat, the strategic placement of structures to channel cooling breezes, all represented accumulated knowledge about local conditions developed over generations of observation and adjustment. These were not primitive approximations of modern solutions. They were sophisticated, locally optimized responses to specific climates, developed by people who had no other option and therefore paid close attention to what worked. And so, here we are, at the end of a summer that never quite ended. You've made it through drenched sheets and corsets laced tight enough to rearrange your organs, through kitchens that doubled as saunas, ice boxes that flooded the floor at 2 in the morning, and cities that turned into slow, brick-walled ovens the moment June arrived and didn't apologize until October. You've met the Iceman, chased his wagon for slivers, and understood, perhaps for the first time, why a block of frozen pond water was once considered a minor miracle worth shipping across an ocean. Think about the people who lived through all of this. Not in a single dramatic summer, but year after year, decade after decade, without relief, without the option of adjusting a dial on the wall and watching the problem simply stop. They dressed in wool. They ate quickly before the food turned. They moved their children to the floor, to the rooftop, to the fire escape, wherever the air was slightly less punishing, and they called this living. And it was. It was stubborn, resourceful, occasionally ingenious living, conducted under conditions that would send most of us reaching for our phones to file some kind of formal complaint with the universe. There was a woman somewhere in New York in the summer of 1896, anonymous, unrecorded, one of millions, who sat on the steps of her tenement building at midnight because her apartment was too hot for her children to sleep inside. She had no fan, she had no ice, she had a wet cloth and a certain knowledge, accumulated over many summers, of exactly how long the night had left to go before the air moved again. She waited. She watched. She got her children through it. She got herself through it. And then summer came back the following year and she did it again. That is what the history of summer heat, before the machine arrived to end it, actually looks like. Not grand narrative or dramatic event, but the quiet, annual, deeply personal endurance of people managing a physical reality that offered them no clean solutions, only strategies, workarounds, and the stubborn insistence on surviving until September. It is worth remembering tonight that the cool air moving around you is not a given. It is an invention, barely a century old, built on a humidity problem in a Brooklyn printing plant by a young engineer who was mostly thinking about ink. Before that invention, every summer night in a hot climate was a negotiation. People lost the negotiation sometimes, in ways that were real and terrible and unequal in all the familiar directions. But mostly they managed it, with wet sheets and root cellars and sleeping porches and the collective wisdom of people who'd been paying close attention to what kept you alive through August. So tonight, as the air around you sits at whatever temperature you have decided is comfortable, maybe let that land for just a moment. The sleeping porch is gone. The ice wagon is gone. The drip pan and the soaked sheets and the midnight fire escapes, and the sound of an entire neighbourhood lying awake together in the heat, all of it is gone, replaced by a quiet hum in the wall that most of us have stopped hearing entirely. History is full of suffering that was simply the weather, and full of people who walk through it anyway, who raised children in it, built cities in it, fell in love in it, argued about the best way to bank a fire or wet a sheet or position a window, and kept going. They kept going, and so can you. Good night.